Okay, so I've really got a good news story to tell today, and I hope it'll dispel some of the concerns about ageing and declining populations. So a tight labour market refers to when employers have to work to compete with each other for the available workers rather than a loose labour market where workers have to compete for the available jobs. And it's really the most feared consequence of depopulation, which is to say a shortage of workers. But in fact, it might be among its greatest blessings. And the images on my slides give you a glimpse of another blessing of depopulation, and that's the beautiful possibilities for rewilding. So it's widely assumed that ageing populations will have fewer workers and consequently weaker economies. This forecast comes from econometric models that assume workforce participation is entirely determined by demographic parameters like age, gender, and education. That is, they only consider the supply of human capital and not the demand for the labour. But market theory tells us that both supply and demand respond to each other. A tighter labour market is likely to have increased workforce participation. Employers might widen their selection criteria, employing people with disabilities or people with less relevant experience than the employer might prefer. And they might offer training to make up for the lack of experience or improve wages and work conditions to attract workers. They might invest in equipment and technologies to improve worker productivity and to give them better money's worth out of the higher wages. But it's hard to predict how much of each of these things might happen and how much they might increase workforce participation. So modelers habitually leave out the things that are hard to quantify. But sometimes what they leave out is the main game. Without them, they might come to entirely wrong conclusions. So how can we check what's happening in the real world? And what I'm going to present is fairly crude survey of readily available data, but really the onus of proof is on those who say that there's a problem to demonstrate that this is coming through in data. As it happens, the countries in the OECD have quite a wide range of demographics, with some in advanced stages of aging and some still having high proportions of children. This provides us with a natural experiment to test the prognoses about aging in the workforce. As an initial test, let's look for a correlation between the proportion of people who have paid employment and the extent of aging. When we use the proportion of people over 65 or the proportion of working age people, we find no correlation among the OECD countries. If we look at hours worked per head of population instead of the proportion of people employed, we also find no correlation. And if we take the oldest countries and look at them longitudinally to see if there's any decline in the workforce, there is none evident. There is quite a spread in workforce participation among these countries, but factors other than aging are much more influential. So this lack of relationship, if it persists, means that there should be no hit to the economy from depopulation and no hit to the tax revenue per capita. For the labour elasticity to be responding like this, it implies that it is the demand for workers rather than the supply of job seekers that's the major determinant of the workforce. And this implies in turn that there's already an oversupply of job seekers. So what sort of evidence would support or refute that hypothesis? Here we see that there is a significant correlation of youth underutilisation, so that's unemployment plus underemployment, against the rate of growth of the working age population, which means when greater numbers of people are being added to the workforce each year, young people find it harder to get a job. And on the right, the income share of the lowest quintile is negatively correlated with the growth in the working age population. When lots of people are competing for jobs, they tend to get lower paid work. So I can only conclude that the tightening of the labour market has not caused less employment, it's caused less unemployment, less exploitative employment, and less income inequality. But what about productivity? Lots of people speculate that older workforces will be less innovative, less agile, and less tech savvy. But there's actually no evidence for this. So in chart A, you can see the extent to which the working age proportion has already shrunk in different countries. And I've grouped the developed OECD countries into 3 groups according to the extent of working age contraction from its highest point. They're in the blue and green colours. And on the right-hand chart, if you just look at these blue and green lines, there's actually no significant difference between them in their productivity growth since the global financial crisis. But if anything, the older countries in the dark blue might be doing better than the younger ones in the green. The emerging countries in red and orange have a higher productivity growth in percentage terms because they're coming from a lower base, but in absolute terms, they're fairly similar to the developed OECD countries. They fall into 2 groups. There's the Eastern European countries in the orange, which are rapidly aging due to high rates of emigration as well as low fertility, and the southern late transition countries in the red that are not yet off their peak of working age proportion. Again, the difference between them over the past decade is insignificant. But since 2000, when they actually both started with fairly similar levels of productivity, the Eastern Bloc countries have done better than the Southern late transition countries. The other line there in pink is South Korea, which didn't fit in any of these groups because of the timing and the speed of its fertility transition. So we won't make any comparisons there. But what about the costs of aging? Healthcare costs are an easy one to look at. And among the comparably rich OECD countries, there is no trend in the amount, proportion of GDP that's spent on healthcare against the extent of aging in the countries. So USA is not included in this correlation because it's an obvious outlier. Certainly, older populations will have higher demands for health services, but the cost of providing those services depends on a range of policy settings, not just on the number of older people. If you want to find out how to develop good health systems with good outcomes, look at Japan rather than USA. But even if we do assume that the costs will increase in proportion to the population over 65, how does this compare with the costs of trying to remedy the situation by boosting population growth? Lots of countries are seeking to increase the birth rate or the immigration to offset aging, but they're not counting the cost of the extra infrastructure needed by the added people or the greater education costs of having a younger age profile. In these charts, I ran a series of projections for Australia, varying immigration to generate exponential growth so that the projections reached stable growth rates and age structure. And actually, it didn't make a tremendous amount of difference to the proportion of working age people, nothing that a modest increase in workforce participation wouldn't cover. So in chart C, we find that the cost of infrastructure and education completely offsets the savings on pensions, healthcare, and aged care in the younger, rapidly growing scenarios compared with the older, stable or declining scenarios. And that's before considering, firstly, that older people are getting healthier so that the cost of healthcare might not increase in proportion to the over 65 population. And secondly, that as cities are getting bigger and more dense, they demand ever more costly infrastructure solutions like road and rail tunnels and water recycling that escalate the cost of population growth over time. So when we add these benefits of a tighter labour market to the many benefits of declining populations, we get a pretty rosy picture of depopulation. In a tighter labour market, we expect that adults will spend less of their time out of the workforce and have more years of employment and greater lifetime earnings. We expect employers will invest more in raising the productivity of their workforce through training and equipment. And because wages are higher, the proportion of GDP going to wages will start to increase and recover from the decline that it has recently incurred. And as a result, income inequality will lessen. With fewer young people unemployed, we'll probably have less crime. And with more work and higher wages, people will have more opportunity to save for their retirement. Due to declining populations, they'll also enjoy improving housing affordability, and balance of trade would probably improve because there's no reason that exports would decline on account of domestic demographic change, but demand for imports will decline. We'd have the opportunity for better public infrastructure provision and more investment per child. And all of these things together will improve the range of lifestyle choices available to people. Then we have all of the environmental benefits of reducing the human demands on nature. Resource scarcity issues will ease, and there'll be increasing opportunities for rewilding, improving biodiversity. And last but by no means least, it'll be easier to reduce greenhouse gas emissions quickly in places where the demand for energy and other resources is also falling. So just to recap, we found no evidence that older populations have fewer people in paid work, nor lower productivity, nor do they spend more on healthcare. In contrast, where working age populations are growing rapidly and competing intensively for jobs, they have more youth unemployment and underemployment, and the lowest paid people are worse off, increasing income inequality. If countries boost their population growth to avoid depopulation and aging, the extra cost of infrastructure and education can outweigh the savings on proportion of GDP spent on the elderly. So we should be celebrating the benefits of older declining populations and not pursuing policies to evade this very beneficial demographic evolution. How often do we hear people refer to growing populations as thriving and declining populations as struggling or senescing, without any evidence that the first is better than the second? So let's have no more talk of demographic malaise until we have real-world evidence that the problems are so great that they outweigh the many benefits. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.